Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second in a series of 6 presentations in the State Historic Preservation Office series, Shut the Door! Barns in Oklahoma series, featuring Dr. Brad Bays, professor in the Oklahoma State University Geography Department. My name is Shay Otley, and I will be one of your moderators this evening. This presentation will be recorded and posted for viewing by tomorrow. From 2009 to 2014, through a contract with the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office, Dr. Bays traveled the state of Oklahoma, visiting every county looking at historic barns. Tonight, Dr. Bays will discuss 3-bay and crib barns in Oklahoma. If you have questions, please post them to the Q&A feature of the application, and Linda Ozan will share those with Dr. Bays at the end of his presentation. Please note that the public will not see the question until it is published by the moderators. If we do not get to your question by the end of the evening, we will provide the question to Dr. Bays and get back to you with an answer. Thank you for attending and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Shay, and welcome everybody, and thanks for showing up for this second installment. Tonight I want to talk about two very different species or subspecies of barns, and I'm going to spend the first part sort of describing what these are and sort of their characteristics, and then I basically have a question, and I don't know if the question is answerable at this point yet, but I have some ideas, and I'm going to share those ideas with you. This is one of my very favorite maps, and there are other maps like it that are also intriguing. This was a map that was created by a fairly famous cultural geographer by the name of Wilbur Zielinski. And Dr. Zielinski spent a lifetime, essentially, a very long lifetime, trying to understand the cultural patterns of the United States. Well, some areas of the United States are fairly easy to regionalize. We all know that Georgia is a southern state. We all know that Iowa is a Midwestern state, and we all know that Massachusetts is a New England state, and Colorado is a Western state. However, Oklahoma being settled so late, being opened up to widespread settlement from in the form of land runs and land lotteries and other modes of taking land, as well as, of course, the early settlement of the Native Americans from all over the country, makes Oklahoma a very intriguing, uncertain state. And I've long believed this myself. I'm from north central Oklahoma. I spent the better part of my life here. I've lived in Mississippi. I've lived in eastern Tennessee. I've lived in Nebraska. I've lived in Louisiana. And in all those places, people have a different perception of the location of Oklahoma within the general country. And I think Zielinski was also, in his writings, also very intrigued about Oklahoma. He called it sort of a special case. It's the meeting ground of certainly the South and what he called the Southwest, the West, and the Midwest. So there really aren't many states that have that great variety. And the evidence for these regional patterns, and of course the boundaries are meant to be not necessarily set in stone, more like areas of transition more than strict, stark boundaries. The types of evidence that Zielinski used for this was things like dialect, religion, types of agriculture, and the list goes on. And I've found many other regionalizations of the Midwest and of the upland South, both of which we'll talk about today. And I'm fairly convinced that Oklahoma is so diverse and the change is so rapid from point to point within the state. Certainly precipitation, annual precipitation varies enormously from 54 inches in the southeast to 14 or 16 inches in Cimarron County. So what I'm going to try to do here is let you see some patterns on the landscape that I think reflect the interesting diversity of the state. And I'm going to start by maybe reminding us that Oklahoma, at least Oklahoma Territory, gained a population very rapidly. We just celebrated the April 22nd land run day for the unassigned lands in the central part of the state. Of course, there were other land openings, generally the so-called surplus lands of the Indian reservations in the central and western part of the state that underwent allotment, forced allotment. And there were some land lotteries, and then the final one, the Cherokee Outlet opening in 1893. So from about, over a course of 4 or 5 years, the Oklahoma Territory gained an enormous population in a flash. So the Oklahoma Territory, as I'm referring to it, would include Beaver County, the Panhandle in 1889 and 1890, and everything outside of the 5 civilized tribes, we'll say the 5 tribes region, which today has been designated as 5 reservations, at least reservation status. And so the question is, what about the entry into eastern Oklahoma? What sorts of barns did people bring or did farmers build from their cultural memory in the earlier settled Indian Territory and the more recently settled Oklahoma Territory? So that's kind of my question. Here's another painting, not of the land run, but of the Trail of Tears, and a more famous painting memorializing the forced removal of the Cherokees during the winter of 1838 and 39. Not all tribes suffered as much as the Cherokees, but they definitely were forced out. There were earlier groups that voluntarily left in the early 19th century, as much as 25 years before the Indian Removal Act of 1830. They were very small groups, and the removal question, the removal issue split most tribes between a minority of people who were so-called progressives. They were the people who were willing to engage in the white economy, the American economy, and those who wanted to remain on their lands and follow their traditional ways. That were typically the majority of most tribes. However, I wanted to mention that the Cherokees, before any of the other 5 tribes, had interacted with American settlers in Southwest Virginia, in South Carolina, and they had a long heritage or long history of trade for various commodities. And by the time of the American Revolution, the Cherokees in particular were quickly taking up the ways of the upland Southerners. The upland South was sort of developing about the same time. I think it actually developed a bit earlier, but the Shenandoah Valley and the Great Valley of Southern Appalachia were generally the meeting grounds of Germans and Scotch-Irish and English settlers mainly, who were migrating southwestward from southeastern Pennsylvania ultimately, and around Baltimore. And so those interactions between Native peoples and essentially European Americans who had taken up new techniques of constructing houses and buildings out of logs, as well as the material culture was transferred to the Cherokees, who then also interacted with other groups. But it wasn't long after the Revolution that the Muskogee Creeks and then the Chickasaws and Choctaws and later on the Seminole people began to take on the same folk material culture. And so with the removal of the native peoples to their various locations within Indian territory, we have the transfer of those cultural traits that were ultimately picked up in the upper Tennessee Valley. So we've talked about that before. I want to talk, or just remind you of a few things in Oklahoma, some physical geography. We have several sets of uplands, the most rugged being the Ouachita Mountains in the southeast. This is the land of the Choctaw Nation. The Ozark Plateau, a highly dissected lobe of the Ozarks in northwest Arkansas and southern Missouri. This was the land of the Cherokees, still is. And the Arbuckle Mountains, a much smaller area, the oldest mountain range in North America. They're pretty much the domain of the Chickasaws. And of course, we have the Wichitas. We're not going to talk too much about those, but I do want to focus on this. The brown yellow shades on the map are indicative of higher elevation, not necessarily lower precipitation, but higher elevation above sea level. And of course, the higher above sea level you go, the more severe, and also the farther west in Oklahoma you go, the more continental the climate. That is, the more severe the winters, more severe the summers typically, and drier the summers. I mentioned this already, the precipitation map, very wet in the southeast, dry in the northwest. And this is basically a map of major vegetation biomes. Keep in mind that the native peoples, the 5 tribes, came into an area that was, they selected areas that were timbered. And in the northeast, that's the oak hickory forest. In the southeast, it's a little bit different. There's more pine. They refer to it as an oak pine forest. And there are spots in between, but the transition zone is the area that most Oklahomans live in, and it's the cross timbers, the oak woodland, rather small oak trees. But basically what I'm saying here is that the native peoples settling Indian territory settled a more or less forested realm, while the rest of the state, Oklahoma territory, remained prairie, mostly prairie with some riparian forest lands. So let's talk about crib barns. We did talk about crib barns last time, and so here are the reservations, as we will call it today, just to give you an idea of the extent of the area. This is a map from a text by Alan Noble and Richard Cleek called The Old Barn Book, but this map is not necessarily special to that book. It is a map of the extent of the upland south for the most part. I think it's a little bit beyond the upland south, but most certainly if the upland south would be contained within this general area. Well, this is the area that's, at least the southern part here, is recognized as the area where you would find log barns and log buildings as commonly used. And the map actually works fine for Oklahoma. And this isn't much of a, it's not intended to be a very accurate map, but I think that everything that I've found in terms of the nearly 2,000 barns that we observed, that were recorded, pretty much conform to this pattern. I'm going to show you some maps of agriculture. And there are 3 important grains that we need to, or 3 important crops that we should consider when looking at these patterns of barns. And the first 2 are mostly associated with, well, anyway, corn was in 1925 basically a crop grown by most farmers. The only place in Oklahoma in 1925 where corn really wasn't that important of a crop was in the area that was arising as the winter wheat belt. And the winter wheat belt by 1925 was going strong in Oklahoma. The darker shades in the Ozarks and the Ouachitas and the more rugged parts of the sandstone hills indicates generally a pattern of subsistence agriculture. And by 1925, there was still a good amount of subsistence agriculture. Really, the only mechanization in 1925 was occurring out here in the Panhandle and perhaps some of the areas around Enid and and perhaps in the northern part where the wheat belt was extending. Everywhere else, isolation was the norm, and isolation was the rule in the old Indian Territory in 1925. So corn fed livestock and it fed people. Now, by 1925, Oklahoma had quickly engaged in the cotton business. We became one of the largest cotton growing states around this same time. I think it was 1920. We were number 3 in the country in cotton production, which is amazing. Cotton came late and left early, though. Generally, it wound up sticking in the southwestern part of the state. And of course, after 1925, it waxed and waned. Today, we have cotton production farther north in Oklahoma for whatever reason. The crib barns are associated with those two crops for the most part. Crib barns are the single crib barns are basically what you find throughout the old cotton belt. I found very few large barns in the southern, really the southern tier of counties along the Red River. This is mostly because of the predominance of cotton farming. And we also had, for some reason, a lot of attrition of barns in this area. But definitely, cotton production does not lend itself to farmers constructing large barns. Barns are not really needed for cotton production. The crop is picked, it's taken to a compress and baled, and that's the way that the cotton is marketed to the processor. On the other hand, corn is mostly a subsistence crop, at least in 1925, and that is used for various purposes. There are specialized buildings called corn cribs, and mostly log corn cribs in the southeastern part of the state. So the log construction techniques that we covered last time in February involve different types of joinery. These are the locking and sometimes not locking notches that support the wall, and most of the weight in a log building is riding on those notches. And this is from one book on log barns by Terry G. Jordan, Terry G. Jordan Bishkoff, and he is probably one of the best authorities on log construction in academia. So this is a drawing indicating different types of wall joinery, notching, and the point that he was trying to make here is that American Midland construction inherited these things from Europe, from both the Alps and perhaps in this case Germany, but also from the Scandinavian countries. This is where we have log barns, and this is generally where we have a predominance of crib barns. And I'll show you some crib barn information now. Sometimes, at least one scholar has attempted to come up with a sort of an evolutionary track, a lineage of barn forms, crib barn forms, and that's admirable. But I really don't think it's necessary, at least for our purposes here. And I'm very wary to say that certain types of barns evolved. But what I do want you to see here is that in an illustration again by Terry Jordan, that we have single crib barns, various types. The dash line indicates the ridge line. We're looking down on the roof of the barn. So the dash line is a ridge line, and the darker lines are indicative of the gables and the eave sides. And in some cases, the lighter lines are basically intended to be representing lean-tos or sheds attached to the main structure. When we're referring to log barns, we refer to these squares of logs as cribs. That's just a convention. I didn't create it. It confuses students immensely. To them, a crib is a bedroom or something like that, but we call it a pen. But anyway, we're going to talk about cribs here. Double crib barns can take a couple of different forms. These are all variations of double crib barns. And then we'll see an evolution perhaps to larger barns. Now this I kind of accept, because as American farmers were moving out of the Appalachians into the Midland areas of the Ohio Valley, and as transportation was getting better, we have the need, and our productivity is increasing. We need to have larger storage buildings. Well, you can always build a second crib and make it into a double crib barn. Or you can, when you're building in logs, you're kind of limited by whatever timbers you have available. And so the theory is, at least within the elite of the barn scholar crowd, the general idea is that the double crib barn became a 4-crib barn with a single roof covering everything, and that takes quite a feat to make one giant roof cover these pens. Then someone finally got the good idea that, well, if you're doing that, you might as well enclose that middle space, and then you'd have 6 different cribs within that same roof. So basically a ridge line that runs parallel with the runway of the barn between rows of 3 or more cribs. Now you can have 2 cribs, and it is still a transverse crib or a transverse frame barn. So here is a transverse crib barn of 4 cribs, but the usual thing that you see is a 6-crib transverse crib barn. So just to recap, single crib barns have these basically square blocks, cribs, and then those can take on all sorts of sheds for sheltering wagons or tack or whatever. They're useful for all sorts of things, particularly corn cribs. They often are used and were constructed as corn cribs. I showed you these last time, but we'll have a look at them again. There's definitely a corn crib with a shed, lean-to sheds on either side. Double crib barns, you just take 2 and put a single roof over them. Oh my gosh, it said single pin. Sorry about that. Get confused. So here are the various types of double crib barns. I found quite a few different ones. This was a double crib barn with an overhang as kind of a drive-through double crib barn. Kind of interesting. Another one is more of a standard double crib. Looks almost like a dog trot house, which is essentially the same thing. Sometimes the cribs are stacked. So here we have have two over and under elongated cribs built out of pine logs. It has a big, massive shed on either side, so it's fairly large and useful. And although they're supposed to be very, very, very uncommon, I didn't ever expect to find 4 crib barns, but wound up finding 2 within the survey. This one is now the James Bounds barn down near Kingston in Marshall County. And it's on the National Register now because of the survey. It was a very impressive barn. It was actually built in Texas and moved to this location in 1895. Another one that you would probably pass on the roadway and never suspect it was a log barn, especially a 4 crib log barn, is this one again. Now, the transverse log barn is the transverse crib barn, meaning a transverse crib log barn, supposedly developed in around 1815, and this is actually the work of Terry Jordan. Identified an area probably somewhere between the Great Valley of East Tennessee and Middle Tennessee. And it was incredibly successful. It became the standard. And in fact, in his last book, titled The Upland South, Terry Jordan identified the transverse crib barn as one of just a handful of what he called diagnostic landscape traits of the Upland South. So you see a transverse crib barn, you're probably in the Upland South. They are more or less ubiquitous in what we refer to as the former Indian Territory, eastern and southern Oklahoma. So this is a drawing by the great Henry Glassy, another barn scholar. And this is a good rendition of an actual one from Polk County, Tennessee. But they look, you can almost say you've seen one transverse crib barn, you've pretty much seen them all. This is a log transverse crib barn, one of 2 that we identified in the survey in southeastern Oklahoma, composed of log timbers, half log timbers. These are pine logs, then split and essentially given what's a saddle notch, but sometimes we call it a half moon notch. But it's nothing fancy. It looks kind of like a half dovetail notch, but it's not that fancy. So transverse crib barns, log transverse crib barns. These 2 barns were actually built by the same gentleman around 1909 down in Pushmataha County, only a few miles away from each other in the Potato Hills. Now, most barns that follow the transverse crib form are what we would refer to as a transverse frame barn because they're constructed of dimension lumber. Now, the only real reason farmers would build out of log timbers and take an enormous amount of labor and time doing it is because they didn't have access to dimension lumber, or they didn't have money for lumber. Most of the time, that was a matter of the accessibility to a railroad, and particularly a railroad stop. So the location of railroads in Indian Territory left a lot of gaps, and even into the automobile age of the 1920s, roads were so bad that it was very difficult for farmers to get to a town large enough to have lumber available. So that would change throughout the 20th century, of course, and even the southeastern Oklahoma and the Ouachita Mountains would become accessible. This is a transverse crib barn with two lean-to sheds on either eave side. It looks kind of like it's made out of logs, but it's just rough, basically rough siding. And this is actually pretty close to where I am now in Payne County. This is from Pawnee County. This is a transverse crib log barn that is on the National Register. It's actually owned by a friend of mine here in Stillwater, but it's located in east central Oklahoma. This is from Delaware County, transverse frame barn, same general floor plan. Usually you have grain bins, or what some people call granaries, but a grain bin on one side, a tack room on that same side, and equipment and storage. And then on the other side, you'll typically have stalls for various uses, calving stalls being the most common. And prior to tractors, you had to have horses, and a team of horses took up a pretty good amount of the barn space, at least the floor space. So typically, one side of the barn would be devoted pretty much to the horses, and up above, of course, the hay mow is the primary purpose of the barn during the 20th century, and that is to store fodder, to store hay, but also to store sometimes feed, grain in the stalk as bunched or sheaves of grain. Those were often left in the loft or in the hay mow. So the barn was pretty much the central part of any general farm operation, both in terms of a family subsistence farm or mostly subsistence farm, as well as the growing commercial farms. And you can see later on it would become the breezeway, or the runway would be big enough for smaller gasoline engine tractors. This is a transverse crib granary in southwestern Oklahoma. Another thing you can do with transverse frame barns is you can extend them, you can add to them, and this one was one of the longest ones I was able to record. And the owner told me and verified that the add-ons were came later as the farm became more successful and larger. Another transverse frame plan barn. They're essentially ubiquitous throughout the state. This is one fairly close to me in Payne County. And they can be large and they can be small. This was a close by one, and this was in Pawnee County. There's the Delaware County again. And we'll just throw some more up here. Okay, so the upland southern region that we mentioned was a dynamic place. It was an area that where there was a lot of experimentation around the turn of the 18th century. By the during the early half of the 19th century, it was also an area of experimentation, and the upland South, particularly the Ohio Valley, and especially the Miami and Scioto valleys in Ohio and adjacent Indiana, those river valleys were identified or have been identified by scholars such as John C. Hudson, a geographer, as the origin of the Corn Belt. The Corn Belt is the preeminent agricultural region in North America, and it got its start early on in the 19th century. Scholars have proposed a theory that that crib barns coming out of Appalachia evolved into the transverse crib barn. We can accept that. And the transverse frame barn that followed those in areas where lumber was accessible became ubiquitous throughout the upland South. As that was happening, though, in the river valleys on the north side, the north tributaries of the Ohio River, the Corn Belt cattle feeding system was developing. Basically, what that is producing a very large crop of corn and drying it and processing it and turning it into feed to fatten beef cattle. So the Corn Belt beef cattle feeding system began to emerge in the early 19th century in this area right here. And after a while, perhaps by the time of the Civil War, maybe earlier, a new type of barn known as generally a livestock feeder barn or a Corn Belt livestock feeder barn. Some people have gone a little farther in classified sort of subgroups of the feeder barn into things like the three portal barn. I'm not necessarily in that camp. I'm more in the camp of John Fraser Hart, who believes that tradition, it doesn't really mean too much among farmers who are at least successful farmers. Farmers do what the more successful farmers around them do, regardless of their ethnicity or religion or whatever. I think there's a little truth in both, but anyway, the enclosure of that transverse crib barn with eave sheds and the enclosure of those makes for a livestock feeder barn. And those livestock feeder barns were basically hay barns with areas to feed livestock within the periphery around what was the old transverse crib or transverse frame barn. Of course, they served the same purpose as storage and stabling of workhorses and tack and tools. So, but over time, the hay mow would grow larger and larger, and eventually the gambrel roof would become available, especially in the late 19th century when railroad access was very dense throughout the Middle West. So here we have an early map of Oklahoma, an early railroad map of Oklahoma. You can notice that this was before 1910 when Payne County lost a few sections to Noble County, and Woodward County and Woods County were different sizes, et cetera. And anyway, the railroad connections that you see here, this is actually a map produced by a certain railroad company, and but the other lines include the initial line, the first railroad in 1871-72 that went through Oklahoma, crossed through the Chickasaw Nation into the Choctaw Nation, up the Muskogee Creek Nation, and into the Cherokee Nation, and that was the primary way that non-Indian whites entered Indian territory. After the MK&T Railroad, the Katy Railroad arrived, after 1872, we see the growth of towns, we see the growth of the white population. By about 1890 or 1900, we see agricultural specialization developing. The Corn Belt being probably one of the first real specialization regions. But we also had a spring wheat belt that had arrived from its origins in really the Connecticut River Valley, I guess you could say, or perhaps at least the Hudson Valley. And by 1870, the spring wheat belt was emerging, was extending as far as the Red River Valley of the North up here between North Dakota and Minnesota. That was an area of bonanza farms, large fields, highly profitable investment farms, basically agribusiness of in a real way. The winter wheat belt had emerged mostly as Kansans began to experiment with new varietals of hard wheat, of hard red wheat, and there's soft red wheat, but hard red winter wheat was the one that did the best. And that region expanded north into Nebraska, where it ran into the Corn Belt, and south into Oklahoma, where it arrived and ran into the Cotton Belt. This area where the winter wheat belt meets the Cotton Belt is one of the few, probably the only place in the world where wheat merges into cotton. So you can brag about that fact at a cocktail party next time you're at a cocktail party. Agricultural regions in 1926, this is by a geographer, extended into Nebraska. The Corn Belt was corn for grain largely, and then the areas that were more subsistence were in the east and throughout southern Missouri. But then here's the winter wheat belt, and notice that the winter wheat belt in 1926 was kind of limited to a few areas. This area in eastern Colorado and western Kansas had been settled as early as 1886, but drought throughout the late 1880s pretty much annihilated the attempts by people from farther east to produce wheat and corn. And so the settlement frontier kind of did a double take, as Ian Fraser says, and receded. So this line of recession is something to look at there. Okay, now that was the crib barns. I want to look. Won't take so long, but we have another type of barn that's following that spring wheat belt from basically New England origins. But basically, the so-called three-bay English threshing barn, or just English barn, was the barn form that was really ancient. It was the type of barn that was introduced into the colonial, into the American colonies very, very early. Probably was used in the early 1600s in Massachusetts Bay. The English barn was not necessarily English. It was found throughout Western Europe, especially in France, in the Low Countries, but it was also part of what the English knew. The term barn is actually a derivative. It's an Old English or Anglo-Saxon term that's a combination of barley and place. So bear, bairn is what a barn is. So barn to the English was a place to store grain. Storing livestock with your grain would be ridiculous, foolish. No Englishman in the right mind would do that. The English farmer and the early English colonist had separate buildings for grain storage, separate buildings for livestock, for cattle, for horses, whatever, pigs, and different buildings were just part of that system. Now, the English barn largely disappeared from the colonies except in New England. And the reason for that is because the English barn was really pretty small, not necessarily very adaptable, and it represented sort of backwardness to most farmers. Well, in New England, agriculture never did very well anyway. Farms that survived were always remained pretty small. And if this barn was going to get into the interior, it was going to be taken by New Englanders. New England farmers, however, the successful ones, migrated early to the Hudson Valley and on through the Mohawk Valley of Western New York. In fact, this is where I've taken this photo. This is an actual English three-bay threshing barn used for probably wheat storage or barley storage in Cooperstown, New York. Some people go to the Baseball Hall of Fame. I go to the Farmers Museum. The English three-bay barn in the New England core area is made up of, has a rectangular footprint. It has a simple gable roof. It has eave side entries. That's the key. And these were old, heavy timber construction buildings. They took a lot of work, a lot of timbers to create a very sturdy barn. Basically, the floor plan is like this. You have a central threshing floor. This is the place where wheat, after being harvested, was thrashed, or later we might say threshed. And the thrashing of the wheat onto this wooden, tightly, a very tight boarded threshing floor this is where the grain was separated from the chaff. Once you open the doors on a windy day, that chaff could be easily blown away. And so you're left with grain on the threshing floor. Now, there was also a border right here in the runway to hold that grain in if you had big piles of it. That later became known as the thrash-hold. The thrash-hold. But the three-bay barn was basically for one area was for storing straw from the wheat straw, and another side was for storing sacks of grain. You didn't bring livestock into the barn, not until you're closer to the Germans. And as the Yankees moved into the Ontario Lake Plains, into the Great Lakes region, they encountered German settlers who had a tradition of not only mixing grain storage with cattle, cattle pens and horse stables, but sometimes even living in the barn with them. The English began to need more space for their livestock. They began to use the English barn for stables and whatnot. So the plan here shows a sort of an altered English barn with some stalls in it. Again, this is from Cooperstown. This is the inside of that same stall. Note the giant timbers. This barn is not going anywhere anytime soon. This is a cutout from another illustration from Alan Noble. Inside of the barn. This is the hay mow, but this is actually, there could be another level up here that could be referred to as a loft. All right, so back to that story. The English barn is introduced along the eastern seaboard. It only survives in New England. It is taken west by wheat farming Yankees until it reaches this area all the way to the Midwest. There was a wheat farming frontier along the Great Lakes beginning in the immediate post-revolutionary era. And throughout each year, when the old Northwest was settled into new states and new territories and states, the wheat frontier pushed west, and as it pushed west, those areas farther east tended to be less competitive because as more wheat was grown, the price of wheat fell, and the fields of these farmers tended to be too small to maintain the same type of production. So what did they do? The wheat farming frontier pressed westward, And in its wake, as old wheat farmers folded, what happened was they generally switched to dairy farming. So the dairy belt follows the wheat belt. Eventually, the dairy belt winds up following wheat all the way into Wisconsin and Minnesota. And eventually the wheat belt would reach the Dakotas. So the English barn gets raised. It's basically lifted, and a masonry wall ground floor is created, basically needing a ramp or some kind of slope entry to the barn. And we'll see more of that next time when we talk about stone barns and bank barns. But eventually, this form gave rise to the essentially the Wisconsin dairy barn and derivatives. Now, this is an English barn, bar none, no question about it. It happens to be near Heavener, Oklahoma. Now, there's a good reason for this. It was the plantation of a wealthy Choctaw citizen, I believe, and who had more than likely been educated in New England and saw these barns and probably wanted to build one like it. Perhaps he even had a New Englander help him build it. But that's the exception. Now, if there were any English barns getting to Oklahoma, they would have probably come with the Midwestern settlers who arrived into at least the northwestern part of Oklahoma during the land runs, particularly the unassigned runs in '89 and the Cherokee Outlet run in 1893. This is the heart of the winter wheat belt. Wheat farmers were going for new land in 1889 through 1893. In fact, a lot of wheat farmers had been pushed out of their lands in places like eastern Colorado and western Kansas. A lot of them had essentially given up on the homesteading process, leaving before a crop could be made, relinquishing their claims in those areas to ranchers. So most of those western high plains farmers who experienced drought and miserable ruin in the late 1880s were looking for somewhere to go. On the other hand, back east, the Midwestern states such as Iowa and southern Wisconsin, northern Missouri, were in a dilemma because the leapfrogging migration pattern that had always been the norm within the Middle West, that is, people from Ohio didn't necessarily settle in Indiana. They generally went to Illinois because it was one generation away. People in Indiana generally didn't go to Illinois. They went to Iowa. And so once people were in Iowa and maybe Illinois and northern Missouri, where were they going to go? They couldn't go to the Great Plains. And right about that time, they were looking for land as well. So the Oklahoma land openings were no accident. However, I think that these wheat farmers who came into the area probably were, and many of them were, from the majority of them were from the Middle West rather than the southern states. I think it was probably about 2/3 to 1/3 in ratio at the most, northerners versus southerners into the unassigned lands and the outlet. They brought with them traditions that they had brought from the upper Middle West, from northern Illinois, northern Indiana, northern Ohio. And with them, I believe you see the examples of what I think in most every way are the English barn form, if not the English barn itself. All of these have side entries or eave side entries. This is a great example. Although the the bays, each of the sides, would be sometimes enclosed to make grain bins. Sometimes they weren't, as in this case, just open bays. All of these are from more or less western Oklahoma. Most of them are from northwestern Oklahoma. The same form can receive a gambrel roof, makes it more like a transverse crib looking barn, but they're basically the English crib barn, the English threshing barn. Now, no threshing took place on the floor. That's not, I don't want to give that impression. Oklahoma wheat farmers were late in the game, and so they were, mostly they were mechanized early. Definitely they used threshers, generally steam-powered threshers or threshers powered by a flywheel on a tractor. So we don't have the family threshing wheat, but we do have the same form following these settlers. This one is from Major County. It's a real interesting one. Sometimes they look good, sometimes they don't. This is actually a bank barn. This is way out in northwest Oklahoma, Woodward County. This is up in Kay County. I don't know if it's actually this is probably a stretch. I think this is probably a German barn of some type. One of my very favorites is a granary in Cimarron County, a remnant of the Dust Bowl. This was ground zero of the Dust Bowl, but this was a massive grain elevator, or actually what we call a country elevator, or basically a granary. We call it a granary. That tall thing houses a system of, it's a conveyor belt with cups on it that you can use to move grain around into the different bins. So I'm going to fly through these real quickly, and we're about done. So I will show you some more of these. We've got a few left here. Some are not looking so great. And I will leave it at that. Okay. So with that, I will see where we are here. Take some questions. Oh, I want to leave you with this one. This is one of my favorites. Just a good photo. This is a transverse crib pattern, okay? So the transverse crib barn was also successful, or this transverse frame farm was also successful on the Great Plains in the wheat farming country. That's a different story, though. So I'll be happy to take your questions. And again, thanks again to the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office, the OSU College of Arts and Sciences, and particularly Malvina Heisch and Linda Ozan. And I'll stop.
All right, Brad, this is Linda. I have a question to pose for you, which is, where were you surprised to find some of these crib barns?
Where was I surprised to find? Well, you know, when I was doing the survey, I was in learning mode. I didn't really get surprised so much. Probably I was most surprised by the high quality of construction of a lot of the older, larger barns. In terms of crib barns, the crib barns were not something that people had a greater affinity for, and they probably weren't. Kept up as much as they could have been. I guess to answer your question, I was probably most surprised in terms of crib barns. I was most surprised by the large number of surviving log barns out there. They're all over the place in southeast Oklahoma and in northeast, in the Ozarks and Ouachitas. They're all over the place. And I never really knew they were so common. Another question?
Uh, that was first one I saw. Let me go back. I have to switch between views. I'm sorry.
That's right.
Give me a minute.
I can't see anything, by the way. All I can
I
see
know.
is small points.
We don't publish them because sometimes people pose questions that aren't really appropriate. And so we keep the questions hidden until we can review them. The other question that I can see is in terms of the different types of barns, how many do you see that are adapted through time? So do they reflect a lot of changes, or were you finding them that were in their original conditions?
Oh, I think just about every one of them had been altered in some way. If not, they were simply heirlooms of the family. Um, that was actually the big problem. And you know, I said we recorded, I think, 1,986 barns, something like that, total. And the big thing that not very many people understand is that I visited, or actually I located thousands more barns, thousands more locations of barns that were no longer there. Okay, and identified them on historic maps, but then aerial photography showed that nothing was there anymore. Sometimes just a foundation, sometimes a new building rather than the old building. So alteration is, yeah. In fact, that's a really important topic and a very interesting topic that I'm still wrapping my head around. Of course, what happens is that wheat farming and cotton farming and general farming have, like most of the rest of the southern states, given way to cow-calf operations, beef production, and these are basically stocker feeder operations. So the ranchers or farmers and landowners are typically leasing land out to people who run beef cattle, and they're basically raising calves and maybe moving out the yearlings in the steers to fattening operations elsewhere. So the need for the adjustment to the cow-calf operation is something that takes place during the 20th century, and I think mostly during the period when you're seeing the United States federal government get heavily into agriculture after World War II, and a lot of government programs are, you know, encouraging people to do new things, or maybe the market encourages people to do new things. But changing from a landscape that was built for farming winter wheat with a barn and maybe granaries, when you switch to a cow-calf operation, you're looking for things like what's referred to as a loafing shed, basically a south-facing loafing shed where cattle can get beef cattle, which are generally not, cared for like dairy cattle. The beef cattle can, come in out of a blizzard or get out of the really cold winds of winter, or they might be able to get some shade in the heat of the summer. So that means that alterations are sometimes really, really common, and that includes, knocking the walls out of a barn and so that it's useful. And then again, just the problem of liability is a real issue, especially if a barn is located near a road or highway. A lot of times, it makes a lot more sense to burn that barn down or just bulldoze it, due to possible people getting injured in them or getting bitten by rabid skunks or whatever. And then, of course, there's the tax issue, but in Oklahoma, that's not so much of a problem. So I hope I answered that question.
Okay, thank you, Brad. I think that's all the questions that we had.
All
We
right. You know
appreciate everything.
how many people are attended?
Looks like we had about 24 in
Oh, good.
attendance.
Okay, great. Great.
Yeah. So we thank you all for attending the second in our series, and we hope that you will sign up for the third presentation, Use of Stone and Bank Barns in Oklahoma. That will be held on June 28th at 6 p.m. We hope to see you there and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.